Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to do an in-depth review of the ASUS ROG Ally X, and this review has been months in the making. I went to New York and tested out an early prototype build of the device, and then they also sent me over an engineering sample to mess around with for about a month. And so now today, finally the embargo has lifted and I can talk about things like battery life and performance and show off all those in-depth details, and that's what we're going to do here today. Specifically, I want to answer three different questions. The first is whether or not the device itself is worth its $800 price point. And then secondly, I want to talk about whether or not it's worth upgrading if you already have an ROG Ally. And then finally, of course, because we can't talk about any handheld PC without bringing the Steam Deck into it, we'll also talk about whether or not it's worth it compared to something like the Steam Deck OLED. And as you've probably guessed, there is a long and a short answer to each of those questions. And the short version is yes, I think the ROG Ally X is the best Windows handheld available right now. But I'm not convinced that it's worth the upgrade if you already own an ROG Ally. And finally, even though I still think that the Steam Deck is probably my favorite overall handheld gaming PC just because of the console-like experience, I now see the ROG Ally X as being the first true competitor for the Steam Deck in that high-end range. So that's the short version, and for the long version, that's why we have this video. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we get started, a quick disclaimer. So this is a review unit that was sent over to me from ASUS. However, like with all my other reviews, all opinions are my own, no money was exchanged in any way, and they're not seeing this video ahead of time. Also of note, the review unit here today is an actual retail unit as opposed to the engineering sample that I had been testing with previously. Now, before we jump too far into the performance and everything else, I do want to do a quick baseline just to talk about the ROG Ally X and what makes it different from the previous model. And right off the bat, I want to emphasize this is not an Ally 2, but rather a Pro model of the ROG Ally itself. And as I mentioned in the intro, this is going to be an $800 machine, at least at launch. Now, last year's ROG Ally came in two different specs. We're going to focus on the high-end one because this one has the same Z1 Extreme processor. And this one initially retailed for $700, but it's now been bumped down to $650. So we are formally looking at a $150 price difference between these two. And so let's go over some of the things that are different and why it may justify that price increase. We'll start with the things that are not different. The first is going to be the processor itself. It's still using the same AMD Ryzen Z1 Extreme. This is a Zen 4 chip with RDNA 3 graphics. It's basically the equivalent of a 7000 series processor from Ryzen, which was their last year's model. And I think this makes sense to not upgrade to an 8000 series CPU just because there's not much of a difference between each year's models. And same story with the display. It's still 7 inches, 1080p with an 120Hz refresh rate with variable refresh rate as well. And I still think it's one of the best 7-inch displays that you can find on handheld PCs today. Yeah, it's not OLED, and I think the colors could be a little bit more vibrant, but overall, I think that it's good enough. In addition, just having a variable refresh rate screen really helps when it comes to handheld PCs because then you can just hit a target range of frames per second as opposed to trying to hit a stable number. So when it comes to the processor and the screen, it's going to be a very similar experience to what we saw last year, which again was very excellent. And just about everything else on this handheld, both internally and externally, has been tweaked or improved in some way. Let's start with the battery because I think this is the biggest game changer that we've seen on the Ally X. They have now doubled the battery size from 40 watt hours to 80. And as I'll show later in this video, that really does double the battery life that you can expect and sometimes even exceeds that. Now, getting a big battery like this does come at a cost, and that has to do with weight. And the new ROG Ally X is 680 grams or 70 grams heavier than the original Ally and 40 grams heavier than the Steam Deck OLED. But bear in mind that they've done a bunch of engineering to actually bring that weight down more than it could have been. And that's because they've added way more than 70 grams of battery to this device, but they've made all sorts of other engineering tricks to make that weight go down. And this includes a new and improved but smaller cooling system, and then also new plastics with the shell. But fair warning, if you already find the Steam Deck to be a little bit too heavy, this is not going to help because it's 40 grams heavier than that. Not only that, because the Ally X is smaller than the Steam Deck, it feels a lot more dense as well. I kind of like the feeling of having a machine that has a lot of heft to it, but you may not like that experience. Now, internally, they've also made two big changes that I want to highlight. The first is that we now have full M.2 2280 support. And these are the most common M.2 drives that you will find on the market, which means that they will be a lot cheaper. In addition, they've upgraded the RAM in two ways. The first is that it's now 24 gigabytes instead of 16, and it's also faster now, 7500 megatransfers per second. And this means that at the higher end, when we're playing GPU intensive games, games that require a higher amount of VRAM, we should have some sort of performance advantage. Now the Ally X now comes with a standard 1TB drive, but you can upgrade that easily now that we have that 2280 size storage. For example, I picked up this 4TB drive on Amazon for about $200 the other day, so my plan is to expand my storage internally by swapping these out. I've got all sorts of other plans with this drive as well, so we will talk about that more in a future video. Now externally, a lot has changed as well. For example, now the face buttons themselves are deeper, which gives them a more sturdy feeling so they don't wiggle around as much, and it makes it feel a lot more premium. The analog sticks have also been improved. They are now larger with better plastics and bigger grips. They've also recalibrated the tension on them to make them more resistant and again more premium feeling. The D-pad has also been completely revamped. It's now a Sega Saturn style disc that has a lot of nice pivot and good tactile feeling to it. They've also made the shoulder and trigger buttons bigger and more tactile. Now personally, I think that the bumpers could be a little bit less clicky, but they're still great. And the triggers have a nice smooth gliding feel and the perfect amount of travel. Another big change is they've swapped out the proprietary XG mobile port in favor of 2 USB-C ports. And the second port they've added is a full USB 4, which means it has 40 gigabit per second connectivity. And so even though we are losing the ability to use the XG mobile eGPU, which is something that I personally used and enjoyed, we now have all the flexibility of using a USB 4 connection, which we will test later with an eGPU in this video. And finally, the overall ergonomics have been improved on this device. The grips around the back are now quite a bit rounder and bigger, and as I explained in my second look video, I think it's just a more naturally ergonomic thing. When you first pick up the device, you're going to immediately feel that yes, it's been improved. They've also reduced the size of the M function buttons on the back, which often would get in the way when I was playing in handheld mode. I think this new design works a lot better. They are easy to press, but they don't get in your way. And so overall, I think the ergonomics have improved from last year's model, which I go into more detail about in my previous impressions video. Now, one thing I brought up in my previous video was I felt like the ergonomics were not quite perfect, and it had to do with the placement of my pinkies. There's a small angled shelf at the bottom of the Ally X, which I naturally was just putting my pinkies on. And over time, because this device is so heavy, I was putting a lot of weight on those pinkies to the point where they started to hurt. Well, it's been about a month since then, and I found that after about a week of training myself not to put my pinkies down there, it's actually not been a problem at all. And it really was just a matter of training myself to hold the device in the way that it wants to be held as opposed to what I was expecting. I had a very similar experience with last year's model too, in that it felt just a little bit too flat for my hands and I had to train myself to kind of palm it a little bit better. And so much like with last year's model, I had to train myself with this year's model to be able to hold it in a way that didn't hurt my hands. But once I figured that out, I had no problems after that. But I did want to leave this in here as a warning in case you do naturally put your fingers below, it's going to ache over time. And so it is better to just hold it in a way where you're pushing the weight against your palms as opposed to your fingers. And so when it comes down to it, just looking at the specs and the overall outer hardware, I do find myself seeing that yes, this is a $150 upgrade over last year's model. After all, we're getting double the storage and double the battery, plus a 50% increase in RAM with a faster speed. And I also appreciate the fact that the company didn't just upgrade the specs and spit out a new one, but instead they upgraded every little thing when it comes to ergonomics and the components. And so it does feel almost like a super or pro version of the ROG Ally. Now for my part, I'm not a hardware and specs person. I really like to focus on the gaming experience. So when it comes to things like hardware, I really want to know what it's going to be in service of that overall gaming experience. So that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this video for the most part. And as we jump into that, I want to talk about a few software things as they relate to your gaming experience. Let's start with the new and improved Armoury Crate software, which is ASUS's front end. You can launch your games directly from here and set up per game profiles, and you can also go directly into your different game launchers here as well. But what I really want to focus on here is what they call the command center. This is going to be your quick menu options. And this is one thing that I do tweak from the default settings. And generally, these are the settings that I prefer. I like to have all my operating things up top. So that includes things like my TDP, my gamepad controller, as well as my stats. In the middle, it's all about the screen, including resolution and refresh rate. And then finally, down below, we've got a couple other key configurations, which we'll talk about in a moment. Anyway, this is how I personally have it set up. In order to bring up this menu, you're going to press that left command center button. And first and foremost, let's talk about the operating mode because this has changed from the previous Ally. We have three different toggles. We have silent, performance, and turbo. And the silent mode used to be 10 watts, but it's now 13 watts on the Ally X. And this probably has to do with the fact that now that we have double the battery life, you can afford to give it a little bit more juice. And so it's not an apples to apples comparison between the Ally and the Ally X when using these performance modes. In fact, if we run the TimeSpy benchmark on both systems, both on running silent mode, you can see there's a big difference in performance at the 13 and 10 watt TDPs respectively. It's a similar story with their middle setting, which they call performance mode. This one previously was 15 watts, but now it is 17 watts on the Ally X. Now, doing a benchmark between these two doesn't show that big of a net difference between the two, and I think that's because both of these are able to push that TDP all the way up to a full 24 watts, and so I think that's probably what's happening here. Either way, when it comes to performance mode with these two, we are seeing a slight edge with the Ally X when it comes to synthetic benchmarks. And then finally we have turbo mode, which remained at 25 watts for both the Ally and the Ally X. However, even though these are both running at 25 watts, you can see that there is a performance edge with the Ally X over the Ally. And this likely has to do with the fact that the Ally X now has more and faster RAM. Regardless, my main point here is that when it comes to comparing the Ally to the Ally X, it's not an apples to apples comparison. Instead, when we get to that section, we'll compare them by talking about things like the real world experience of playing games on these devices with their new specs. Now, a couple of other notes about the command center. Like I mentioned in the middle section, this is where we're going to make all of our screen adjustments. We've got 3 different resolutions to choose from: 1080p, 900p, and 720p. We can also adjust the refresh rate from 60 to 120 Hz. And then finally, we can also implement a frame rate cap if we'd like, and there are a bunch of different increments that we can choose from. Now finally, the last command center thing I wanted to mention is CPU boost, because this seems to be unintuitive. By default, it's turned on, and your first impression might be, okay, good, more CPU the better. That means we're going to have better performance. But given the fact that we're talking about integrated graphics, which are going to use the same resources as the CPU, we don't want to give a bunch of power to the CPU and then starve the GPU. Instead, on a device like this, it is better to starve the CPU and push as much juice as you can into the graphics. And this CPU boost is a great example, because in most cases, you're going to want to turn this off. Let's use Animal Well as our example. This is a moderately lightweight game. We can play this game at 1080p in high settings, and it's not going to require much power. In fact, the power profile is going to balance itself out at about a 7 watt TDP, which is going to give us about 8 hours and 15 minutes of gameplay. And this is one of those games where it doesn't require additional resources if it doesn't need it. For example, if we push it from the silent mode, which is going to cap out at around 13 watts, and we push it up to the performance mode, or 17 watts, it's still going to remain at a 7 watt TDP, because that's all the power that it needs to run at 60 frames per second. So regardless of the performance profile that you use, this game is going to run really well on the Ally X. However, if we turn on that CPU boost mode, it's going to push additional resources into the CPU, which are not necessary to run this game at full speed. And so now all of a sudden, even though we're getting the exact same performance, it has a much higher power demand because the CPU is now going to be boosted. And so we've gone from about 8 hours and 15 minutes of gameplay down to 3 hours and 55 minutes with the exact same performance. And so this is what I mean by saying that CPU boost should be turned off, and it's on by default. So make sure that you go in here and turn this off before you do anything else. There will be some games that do benefit from it, especially high-end emulation like PS3, but even then I would still caution you to try it with CPU boost off first and then only turn this on as a last resort. Okay, so now that we've set up a baseline in terms of what settings I'm going to be messing around with as we go through the rest of the video, let's now actually jump into performance and talk about how that works in terms of battery life and all the other options that we have. And this entire video is actually going to be a battery life test. I'm actually going to show the estimated battery life for every single game as we play it. And I came up with these numbers based on an average watt hour that I was seeing in terms of performance while playing through about 20 minutes of each game. From there, calculating with the size of the battery, I was able to figure out how many hours and minutes we should expect for each game as we play them. And I also did a similar calculation for both the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally, which we will get into as we get into those comparisons. And so for every game that I test, up top I'm going to show all the settings in terms of the resolution and the power mode, and then down below you'll see the expected battery life with those settings. So let's talk about a best case and a worst case scenario. We're going to start with the most lightweight game that I could find. This game is called Cosmic Collapse, and it's actually a Pico 8 game that's been ported over to Steam. So as you can imagine, this one basically requires no resources, and so we can get a whopping 13 hours and 20 minutes battery life on this device. So now let's talk about a worst case scenario. This is where I'm going to play a demanding game at the highest settings possible, but then also push the performance mode as much as I can as well. And you can see here that even when I'm pushing everything to the max of what it can handle, I'm still getting an hour and 47 minutes of gameplay. To give you a comparison with the original Ally, I did these exact same tests and got 43 minutes of battery life. And so I love the fact that at a worst case scenario, we're going to get something very close to 2 hours of gameplay, and that's when pushing the device to its max. Now, when it comes to actually playing games, I would rarely push it to this worst case scenario, but it is comforting to know that I can get pretty close to 2 hours of battery life no matter what. Now, one thing that goes hand in hand with performance in gaming devices like this is the overall cooling profile. How is it keeping cool, and also how loud is the cooling fan? And one of the things that ASUS has done with the Ally X is improve the cooling profile overall. There have been 3 major changes. The first is that they've changed out the fans internally to make them more efficient but also quieter. In addition, they've improved the ventilation. So up top, we now have a third vent near the screen, which is supposed to cool off the screen. In addition, they've improved the ventilation on the back to allow more air to come into the device before it pushes out of the top. And so even though the fans are smaller and lighter than they were previously, they seem to be a lot more efficient. To be honest, the only times I even notice the fan is when I plug it in and go to that full 30-watt profile. And so at that point, I do hear the fans kicking in, but not to the point where it's distracting in any way. I think it's actually a pretty pleasant sound and overall moderately quiet. And so all told, I am very happy with the cooling profile on this device. Now, another sticking point with the original ROG Ally was the SD card reader, because this would burn up on certain devices. In fact, I personally had 2 different SD card issues happen with mine last year as well. Now, I think it's a little bit too early to tell, but I have been testing this SD card reader as much as I possibly could. I've been using this 1.5 terabyte SD card to transfer all my files onto it. So I've gone as far as to download a terabyte of files onto it and then also transfer back and forth a couple times as well. In addition, all of the testing that I've been doing over the past month or so has been on this card alone. And so far, I haven't had a single problem with my SD card reader this entire time. Now, I think time will tell if there are any other issues coming up, but at least as it stands right now, I'm pretty confident in continuing to use my SD card reader for the foreseeable future. Okay, so now that we understand the full context of everything that's going on, from the storage to the cooling to the performance, let's actually now start talking about battery life and what you can expect in different segments when playing on this device. Let's start with the lightweight stuff, and as you've probably already seen, you're going to get some amazing battery life on this handheld, considering the fact that it is an x86 platform. We're talking about, 10.5 hours for really lightweight games, but even those that are a little bit more demanding, still we're getting upwards of 8 hours or more. And so when it comes to lightweight indie games, I would say that somewhere between 10 to 6 hours of gameplay should be about the norm, depending on how intensive that game is. And I think this experience is leaps and bounds better than playing on the original Ally. Even when playing lightweight indie games, I had to watch that battery because it would drain faster than I would expect. This is at the point where I don't even have to think about battery life at all, other than reminding myself to charge it every once in a while. Now, as we start moving into more intensive indie games, things like Hades or Cult of the Lamb, we're going to see somewhere less than 4 hours of battery life, usually between 3 and 4. But also bear in mind that there are things that I could do to make this an easier experience. For example, with Hades, I could cap this out at 60 frames per second and have more time to play. Now, after we get past this spectrum of lightweight and indie games, this is where things get really interesting for me. And that's because since we have such a large battery, that gives us the choice of basically tweaking our gameplay experience to however we would like. Now, I don't know about you, but my very first job was at Burger King. I worked there from the ages of 16 to 18, and I learned a lot about life during that period. And one of the things I remember from my time working at that restaurant was their slogan, which was "Have it your way." And I kept coming back to that same idea when talking about the ROG Ally, especially when we get to higher end performance. And I think it's because that 80-watt-hour battery affords us the opportunity to basically have that gaming experience however we would like. So let's jump into a few different games to give a good example of why an 80-watt battery gives us a lot more flexibility. Let's start with what I call an Xbox 360 era game like BioShock Infinite. If I want, I can play this game at 1080p resolution with high settings in performance mode and running the refresh rate at 120 Hz. This is going to give me an average about 90 frames per second. It's going to look amazing, and I'm still going to get a lot of battery life, about 2 hours and 55 minutes. And for me personally, I don't see myself playing this game for more than 2 hours and 55 minutes at a time, but say you wanted to squeeze a little bit more out of it. Well, the easiest thing you can do at that point is just to reduce that refresh rate. Instead, play it at a solid 60 frames per second. That's going to give us about 20 minutes more of battery life. So that's really going to be up to you. Do you have 2 hours and 55 minutes to play, or would you rather push it to 3 hours and 17? Now, let's say you're jumping on a plane and you want even more battery life than this. You want to make sure you get through as much as you can of BioShock Infinite. At that point, we can adjust the resolution. We're not even touching the settings. All we're doing is dropping it down to 900p instead of 1080p. And that's going to give us a whopping 4 hours and 30 minutes. So we're getting an additional hour and 13 minutes just by dropping it down from 1080p to 900p. And the big secret here is that 900p on a 7-inch screen like this looks just about the same as 1080p. And so this is what I mean by saying that you have flexibility here. Depending on how much time you have to play, you can adjust this to either a high refresh rate or a high resolution, or drop them down to both really excellent levels still and get 4.5 hours of gameplay. And also bear in mind that every game is going to be different, so some tweaks that you do in one game aren't going to be as effective as they are in another. A good example is Control. We can play this game at 1080p in low settings, and in performance mode we can get about 2 hours and 28 minutes of battery life. And again, I think that's not too shabby considering the fact that we're playing this game at such a high resolution. And the average frame rate here is going to be around 45 to 50 frames per second, and with a variable refresh rate screen, that still means that everything is going to look nice and smooth. But let's say you really want to hit 60 frames per second without wasting any battery life. Well, in that case, it'd be better to drop it down to 720p. That's going to give you a more stable 60 frames per second, but just bear in mind, it's not going to give you a big bump in battery life, only about 7 minutes altogether. So here, we're still getting around 2.5 hours of gameplay no matter what way we play it, but we can either favor graphics or we can favor frame rate. Let's do Baldur's Gate 3 as our next example. We're going to play this game starting out at 900p resolution and low settings, and we'll put it to turbo mode. This is going to push the TDP somewhere between 25 and 30 watts depending on the game, and you can see the battery life is going to be just under 2 hours here. And in terms of frame rate, I would expect an average of about 55 frames per second unless you're in a very intense scene. Now, when it comes to extending the battery life, we don't have a ton of options. In fact, dropping it down to performance mode is still going to push the TDP all the way up to a full 24 watts. And that's going to make the frame rate drop to an average of 45 to 50 frames per second, but we're only going to get about 20 minutes additional battery. So in this case, it may not be worth dropping down that refresh rate in order to save 20 minutes. It may not be that important. And to add further fuel to the fire, if we try to drop it down to 720p, that's only going to give us about 4 minutes extra battery life. That'll bring the frame rate closer to 60 frames per second, but even then, it'll be a compromise one way or another. For my part, I think I would probably just play it in turbo mode, get the best graphics that I can with a pretty good frame rate, and then just deal with the fact that I'm going to get about 2 hours altogether. And finally, let's do one more example. Let's talk about frame rate cap. And in some cases, this will actually make a big improvement. If you play a game at 30 frames per second versus 60 frames per second, you will usually see a lot more battery life. But again, like with the other games, this does have some context because sometimes it will not work better in certain games. A good example here is going to be Final Fantasy VII Remake. I'm playing this at 1080p with a mixture of high and low settings and in performance mode, and I can get an average of about 60 frames per second. It will dip down here and there, but that variable refresh rate will keep things going very smoothly. And this will give us about 2 hours and 51 minutes of battery life. Now in the game, there is also a 30 frames per second toggle. And I was surprised to find that this only gave me 11 minutes extra battery life, going from 60 frames per second to 30. So in this case, I think it's a no-brainer. I would just play it at 60 frames per second, and yeah, I'm going to lose those 11 minutes, but I'm going to have a much better time for the 3 hours that I actually play it. So in putting this all together, when we make all those adjustments in terms of the performance modes and the resolution and the refresh rate, I think you'll find that that's one of the things that an 80 watt-hour battery can really afford you, is that you can mess around with these settings and all of them are going to be a good gameplay experience depending on what you prioritize. If you want to play a lightweight game but with a higher refresh rate, you can totally do that. It is going to drop down the battery life, but because it's 80 watt-hours, you're still going to get at least 2 hours of gameplay for the most part. In a similar vein, if you wanted to drop down the resolution or maybe the overall graphics quality, you can still push AAA games to get a lot of battery life as well. I found that on average, I can expect at least 2 hours of gameplay as long as I'm not pushing it to the very max. And for me personally, when we're talking about a handheld gaming device, something that I'm going to be playing portably, I usually will lose interest about 2 hours in anyway. And so for me, this has been an excellent balance between the type of games that I like to play and all the configurations that I can make to make sure that my gameplay experience matches my needs. And that's one of the big strengths about PC gaming, is that you can adjust things however you would like depending on what you like the best. And I think that the Ally X, compared to any other handheld PC that I've seen on the market, affords you the most flexibility in that regard. So if anything, when it comes to being a PC, this seems to be the most PC-like of the handheld PCs that I've ever seen. Okay, so that's a quick summary of handheld PC gaming on the ROG Ally X, but there's still more that we can talk about. And that's because this device can function as a full docked PC, and you can also plug it into external GPUs. Now, the docked PC experience is very similar to what it is in handheld mode, but you get a little bit extra juice. And that's because when you plug it in, it's going to automatically go into turbo mode, and it's going to push the TDP from 25 watts up to 30. And even then, it'll push the TDP to a full 42 or 43 watts as the game requires it. And what this generally means is that you can easily push up the resolution scale by a half point. So if you're playing a game in 900p, you can now play it at 1080p and get a similar performance. So for example, with Marvel Spider-Man, this is a game that I would recommend playing at 900p in handheld mode, but you can play it at 1080p and get an average frame rate of about 45 watts when playing it docked. Another great example is going to be God of War. This one I typically will play at 720p in handheld mode, but I can play it at a full 1080p and get a similar frame rate when in docked mode. So you will see some moderate improvements just by plugging in the device and hooking it up to a TV, and if you're interested in that kind of gameplay, this will suit your needs pretty well. However, if you want to take it a step further, we can take advantage of that second USB-C port to be able to play with an eGPU. For this testing, we're going to use the GPD-G1. This came out last year and it uses an AMD Radeon RX 7600M XT. This is a laptop GPU, but one of the higher end models that are available from AMD right now. The price on this will depend on the model. So last year's model is around $600, but the current year's model, which has a couple extra toggles, is going for $700. So this is definitely on the higher end and not necessarily something that I would recommend. Either way, I do happen to have one from a previous review video that I made, and I'll leave it linked down below. But let's talk about this experience if you do want to go this route. First of all, it is a single cable solution, which is pretty cool because the GPD-G1 is a full USB hub as well. This means you can plug in your HDMI and all of your dongles into that instead of the device itself. Not only that, it will charge the ROG Ally at the same time. Now, in terms of performance, it's not going to be a huge jump, and a lot of that has to do with the bandwidth limitations of the 40 gigabit per second of USB 4. So we're not talking about PCIe speeds, and you are going to lose some bandwidth here overall. Let's start with God of War. So this one I can now play it at 1080p with high settings, and I get an average frame rate about 85 to 90 frames per second. That's still going to be a very good experience compared to what it was like playing it in handheld mode at 720p. However, other games like Elden Ring, even at a moderately high 1080p high settings, isn't really even hitting 60 frames per second consistently. And so while it will improve your overall gaming experience, I'm not sure that it's giving you a $600 to $700 improvement. So really, I would say that an eGPU solution like this is really only going to make a lot of sense if you happen to have an eGPU already. So in the end, I like the flexibility that comes with eGPU support with USB 4, I just don't see it really being very practical right now. Okay, so that's it when it comes to PC game testing. Let's now move into emulation. And as a preface here, I spent a ton of time recording a bunch of emulation footage, way too much to put in a review video like this. And so in a couple days after releasing this video, I'm going to make a separate emulation performance video because I have a lot of things to talk about when it comes to emulation on this device, and I don't think I can cram it all into this one. So be on the lookout for that video coming out, but I still want to talk a little bit more about emulation in general with the Ally X and what you can expect. So let's start with lightweight emulation, and I don't have a lot to say here other than the fact that because we have an 80 watt-hour battery, it's going to give us a ton of gameplay time. For the most part, when it comes to these lightweight systems, they're all going to cap out in RetroArch at 8 watts total package power. This means that you're going to get a solid and even 10 hours of gameplay if you're going to be playing lightweight games like this. Now, as we move our way up to the more intensive platforms available within RetroArch, we are going to see some increased power requirements. For example, when playing Sega Saturn with the demanding Beetle core, you can see that we're getting about 7 hours and 46 minutes of gameplay altogether. I think that's still a ton of time to be able to play Sega Saturn on this machine. When we move up to Gen 6 content, it is going to be a little bit more varied. In a best case scenario, when playing a lightweight game on GameCube like Mario Kart Double Dash, we should see somewhere around 6 hours and 50 minutes of gameplay time. And it is going to be a little bit more demanding in general with Nintendo Wii. I got about 5 hours and 10 minutes with Super Mario Galaxy. Now, when it comes to the more demanding GameCube titles, many of these will require that CPU boost that I warned you not to use previously. But in the case of something like F-Zero GX, as well as Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2, it is going to require CPU boost to get a smoother frame rate. And here I would expect somewhere between 3.5 and 4 hours of gameplay, depending on the game that you're playing. Now, it's going to be a similar story with PlayStation 2. Again, all these games are going to be upscaled up to the resolution of the screen or better, and a best case scenario would be somewhere around 6 hours of gameplay. And a worst case scenario would be something like Champions of Norwrath, which is much more demanding, although it doesn't require CPU boost. This one I found will give you about 3 hours average of gameplay. And we'll go into detail about these platforms and others in that emulation video. For now, let's jump up to another generation because I think this is where a really interesting conversation needs to happen. First and foremost, when it comes to Nintendo Wii U emulation, which is in general less demanding compared to the other Gen 7 systems, this one does give you pretty good battery life. I found somewhere between 5 and 6 hours of battery life on average for most games. Now what I found the most interesting happened to be with PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. These are two platforms that a lot of people want to emulate on handhelds, but I often will not recommend it just because of the power demands. But this is one of those times when having an 80 watt-hour battery will actually brute force the gameplay through so you can get about 2 hours of gameplay no matter what. And so previously I often would try out PS3 and Xbox 360 games on these handhelds more as a tech demo, just to the point where I can say, yes, this CPU is powerful enough to be able to play these games, but the actual gameplay experience is not that great because the battery will only last for an hour and sometimes less. And I found that this was a total paradigm shift for me in the way that I play games, because many games that I would love to play that I never really play on a handheld because of the battery life, I now consider to be fully playable. And so now I'm finding myself playing a lot of PS3 games in handheld mode when I never really considered them previously. This may very well be the first handheld PC where I think it's worth it to actually try out Metal Gear Solid 4 or even God of War 3. And Metal Gear Solid for me has really been hitting a soft spot because this is a game I've been wanting to replay since back in the PS3 days. And now I've got a handheld that I can actually play it for almost 2.5 hours in one sitting. It's also a very similar story with Xbox 360, but I have a little bit less urgency with this platform over PS3. And that's because many of these games are still backwards compatible or at least ported over to PC. But even then, it's a very similar story where you can get somewhere between 2 and 3 hours of gameplay depending on the game that you're playing, and you can push it pretty far. It's really going to come down to compatibility with the emulator and whether or not the game is even going to run. But chances are if the game runs on this emulator, it's going to run on the ROG Ally X, and it's going to give you several hours of gameplay. And finally, just one quick touch on Nintendo Switch emulation purely from a testing perspective. I did find that I got an average between maybe 4 and 5 hours on the low end side, and then somewhere between 2 and 3 hours on the high end side. So as long as you're able to get your hands on an emulator that's currently being updated, you should be able to play the majority of Switch titles on this device. Okay, let's do a quick audio test. So I'm going to test everything here in the studio at 100% volume, and I'm also going to have a microphone. It's not quite like at ear level, but it's pretty close, only maybe a foot away from my ear altogether. So this should give you an idea of what it's going to sound like when you're actually playing it. I'm also going to hold the device in my hands just to give you those natural acoustics as well. Okay, my big takeaways here is that I found that the Ally X seems to be a lot quieter than the other two. In terms of just overall quality of audio, I still think that the Steam Deck is probably my favorite, just because I feel like a lot more presence from the audio and that things are a lot sharper and clearer. It's just that the Ally X seems to be a lot quieter than I was expecting, even compared to the regular Ally. And I think this is probably something that ASUS will tweak over time, but as it stands right now, as of release, I found that between these three devices, which all three give very good audio, the Ally X seems to be the worst of the three. Okay, so that was a lot of testing and way more than I expected to cram into this video. Let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Ally X before we move into comparisons. Let's start with this laundry list of things that I like, and I'm only going to hit the most prominent among them. I like the improved buttons and sticks on this device. It makes everything feel a lot more premium and just more gamer-centric. I also think that the ergonomics, for the most part, have been improved. It took me a while to adjust to holding it correctly, but once I got that figured out, I have had no problems since then. Like with the previous device, I love the screen. The fact that we have 120 Hz refresh rate and its variable refresh rate gives us a lot of options when it comes to very smooth gameplay. I also think it was a good choice to move towards 2 USB ports, and the fact that one of them is USB 4 gives us a lot of flexibility when it comes to things like eGPUs. And of course, the number one improvement for me is the battery life. I really find this to be be a game changer. All of a sudden, we've got a bunch of games and emulation platforms that I never really considered to be capable of being played on a handheld PC, but now, thanks to that 80 watt-hour battery, they are fully playable. And I can expect about 2 hours of gameplay in a worst case scenario no matter what. I also appreciate the fact that the device stays quiet and cool, to the point where I never even really notice it, and I think that's the perfect place to be when it comes to a cooling system. And finally, one of the big benefits of the Ally X, for better or for worse, is the fact that it is a Windows PC. This means you'll be able to play things like Game Pass and Call of Duty and Destiny, things that you cannot play on a Linux platform. And because it comes with Windows right out of the box, you can do all the other Windows things that you can expect. You can dock this into a monitor and actually just use it as your primary PC. Now, like with any other handheld, this is not a perfect device. Let's talk about some of the things that I don't like about the Ally X. Number one, this is a heavy product. It is 680 grams and it has a very dense feeling to it. So if you are concerned about weight, then I would say that this is something that you may want to test out in person before actually buying. Thankfully, they are selling this at Best Buy, so if you have one around, you might be able to try it out before you actually pull the trigger. Another thing to consider is that this is an $800 handheld PC, and that is a lot of money. I do think that this device warrants that $800 price tag considering all the things that you're getting for it, but $800 is $800 no matter how you swing it. And I think for many people that is asking a lot of money just to be able to play PC games on the go. And finally, this one also goes hand in hand with the other column, but this is a Windows PC. And unfortunately, trying to play Windows on a handheld is still a little bit of a work in progress. Once you have everything dialed in, it usually will be a pretty seamless experience, but much like trying to turn an Android phone into a gaming platform, there's a lot of work that you have to do to get everything tweaked just so. So it's not going to give you the same console-like experience as SteamOS. So in wrapping up, let's start talking about the 3 questions that I proposed in the intro of this video. The first was whether or not I think that the ROG Ally X is worth its $800 price tag. And I think based on all the improvements and upgrades that we've seen, including that battery life, I can say that yes, this is worth $800 to me. And so that already answers one of those 3 questions. So now let's talk about whether or not it's worth it compared to something like the Steam Deck, or if you already have the original Ally or some other handheld PC. We're going to start with the Steam Deck, and I'm going to throw a couple things out of consideration right off the bat. We're not really going to talk about the ergonomics or the trackpads or the SteamOS experience. I think there are enough videos out there that really highlight the differences between Windows and SteamOS, and so I don't think we need to go into that further. Instead, I really want to focus on the things that are new with the Ally X compared to the Steam Deck OLED. After all, these are both mid-cycle refreshes. They're both the Pro versions of the original Steam Deck as well as the Ally. So let's start with the low-end systems. Here is Axiom Verge, and we're playing this at 1080p in default settings in silent mode and getting a stable 60 frames per second on the Ally X. Meanwhile, down below, we're doing 800p, the native resolution of the Steam Deck OLED, and again at their default settings. Now, in terms of efficiency, these are about neck and neck. They both require about 8 or 9 watts of total package power to play this game at full speed. However, you can see that having an 80 watt-hour battery on the Ally X versus 50 on the Steam Deck OLED does give us some advantages when it comes to battery life. And so here I got 9 hours and 31 minutes of battery life with Axiom Verge versus 5 hours and 19 on the Steam Deck OLED. Here's another example with Hades. Now this game is a lot more efficient on the Steam Deck compared to a Windows handheld. So here we're getting an average of about 14 watts of total package power compared to 18 watts on the Ally X. But also bear in mind that the Ally X is running at its native resolution of 1080p, which looks a lot sharper than 800p. So even when considering the fact that we're getting a higher resolution and a little bit less efficiency with the Ally X, we're still getting better battery life. Here you can see there's about an hour difference between the two. Not only that, because we have that larger battery, it affords us more flexibility. For example, here with Hades, if I push up the refresh rate to 120 Hz, I'm still getting more battery life than I was on the Steam Deck running at 60. And also bear in mind, this is still at a higher resolution of 1080p versus 800p. So between the two, when it comes to games like Hades, I would rather play them on the Ally X than the Steam Deck. I'm going to get a higher resolution and refresh rate, but then also longer battery life as well. Now let's do a more apples to apples comparison. Let's do Marvel Spider-Man, because this one will actually allow me to tweak the settings to make them pretty parable. So here I'm running both games at 720p resolution under low settings and with a 30 frames per second cap. So really, in terms of graphics and 30 frames per second performance, this is going to be a very similar experience between the two. And even though the Steam Deck is more efficient when playing this game, it's only running at about 18 watts versus 24, the Ally X still gives us more battery life altogether by virtue of having such a larger battery. So here we're looking at around 45 minutes of extra gameplay when we're comparing them side by side in an apples to apples comparison. But of course, again, the Ally X just gives us more room to work with because we have a higher resolution screen, a little bit faster of a processor, and then also that big old battery. So let's try to even out the battery life between the two. Let's say you only have 2 hours to actually play Marvel Spider-Man. To get to around 2 hours of battery life, I can actually push the Ally X to a 900p resolution, and in terms of frame rate, I'm going to see an average about 45 frames per second. By contrast, the Steam Deck OLED is going to have a lower resolution altogether of only 800p. And in terms of performance, it's going to be a little bit slower overall, about 35 frames per second on average. So from a performance standpoint, when we're talking about 2 hours of gameplay with Marvel Spider-Man, we are going to get increased frame rates as well as resolution with the Ally X. And finally, just to wrap things up a little bit more in a neat package, let's do one more test but with God of War. And this is as close to an apples to apples comparison that I can get. I'm going to run the Ally X at 720p with a 30 frames per second cap. And it's going to be similar with the Steam Deck OLED, but with 800p just because there isn't a 720p option within the game. Either way, you can see here that both games are running fairly stably at 30 frames per second, but we are getting better battery life on the Ally X. Again, it is running less efficiently than the Steam Deck OLED, but the battery compensates for that. So we are seeing about 45 or 50 minutes extra gameplay time with the Ally X compared to the Steam Deck OLED. So I think when it comes to the comparison between a Steam Deck OLED and the ROG Ally X, it's a little bit premature to make a decision one way or another. There's a little bit more testing that I need to do. For example, I want to try out Linux-based distributions on the Ally X and see if I can get a very SteamOS quality experience and how that pushes the envelope for me. So as much as I'd love to give a definitive answer right now that one is better than the other, I don't think I'm quite there just yet. When it comes from a performance and battery standpoint, I have found the Ally X winning over the Steam Deck OLED in many different ways. Even though Windows and the Ally X are less efficient compared to the Steam Deck and SteamOS, I think that the larger battery life is kind of overcompensating for it, and I really enjoy that experience. So as of right now, I'm just going to kind of throw my hands up in the air and say, it's going to depend on you, but I am starting to lean more towards the Ally X, and that's the first time I've ever had that conversation with the Steam Deck OLED before. And we will continue this topic in a future video, so if you haven't already, make sure that you subscribe. And then finally, let's talk about the Ally versus Ally X. The first is that if you were just picking up an ROG Ally and $650 is your baseline price, I think it is worth considering an additional $150 for the $800 Ally X. And that's because for another $150, you're getting a lot more handheld, and I do think it is worth that upgrade price. However, also consider that this is only the retail price of the ROG Ally Z1 Extreme. You'll be able to find them used and open box for a lot cheaper, and so that changes the paradigm quite a bit. And so I think the threshold for me is $200. If you're able to find the ROG Ally Z1 Extreme for $600 or less, then I do think that a $200 price difference between the Ally and the Ally X is pretty significant. At that point, I would say that probably the Z1 Extreme might be a better bet, especially if you're not that concerned about battery life like I am. Now, in terms of comparison between the two, I think that the only major sticking point between the two is that battery life. And let's do a couple examples to illustrate my point. We'll start with something really lightweight like Balatro. When playing these games in silent mode, it's about the same total package power, so it's going to be about 9 watt power draw altogether. And that will give us a little bit over 4 hours of gameplay on the ROG Ally, and I think that's plenty of time to play this game. But as you can see with the Ally X, it'll give you double that battery life because it's double the battery. And so if I had to choose one to take on a plane specifically, then obviously I'm going to pick the Ally X. And same thing when it comes to high-end gaming. If we look at Elden Ring here, both at the same settings, we are getting about double the battery life between the two. So if you already own an Ally or a similar Windows handheld and you are thinking about upgrading to the Ally X, then I think it's really going to come down to how much work you're willing to put into it. If you're able to sell your original Ally and get a good amount of money back to the point where that upgrade makes a lot more sense, then I think that yeah, if you're very concerned about battery life, it's going to be worth it. However, for everybody else, if you already own an ROG Ally, I would recommend just spending $100 on a battery bank instead. I've been using this one from Ugreen, which is 25,000 milliamp hours, which is almost the exact same size as the original Ally battery. So this is going to give you a full charge of the battery in one go. So effectively, for a battery pack that costs around $100, you can double your battery life as well, and this seems like a much more frugal choice. So with all that put together, let's go back to those 3 questions. Is the ROG Ally X worth $800? I would say yes. Number 2, is the device worth getting over the Steam Deck? And I think that's a big fat it depends, and we will figure that one out later. And then finally, number 3 is whether or not it's worth upgrading if you already have an ROG Ally or similar handheld. And I would say that no, for the most part, you're probably better off just spending $100 and getting a battery bank in order to double your battery life for a lot cheaper. Because I think that no matter how great the ROG Ally X is right now, I think it's really just a precursor for greater things to come with the ROG Ally 2. If anything, this handheld is a testament to the fact that ASUS is in it for the long haul. They've made all these investments into the platform, and I fully expect to see a full generation leap sometime in the future. So if anything, I would consider this to be the pro model of the ROG Ally. And for me personally, I'm not the type of person that buys like a PlayStation Pro. I usually will wait for the next generation. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing right here. If you're just now getting into the Windows handheld PC space, then the Ally X is definitely the one to get, provided you're willing to spend $800 for that experience. But if you already own the Steam Deck or a similar handheld PC, then I think it's worth waiting for that next generation leap. Anyway, that's really about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and that I answered all of your questions about the ROG Ally X. Let me know down in the comments below if I missed anything. And I can't believe that you spent this much time listening to me rant about these handhelds. You are crazy. Anyway, be on the lookout for my next ROG Ally X video, which will be all about emulation performance. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.